Oscars of 51. So they had to push back the opening. But instead of having a big blowout gala premiere like most studios did, and Paramount did for most of its films, because they knew that they were dealing with, like, the film was like nitroglycerin and it could explode at any moment. They did they did something that I think is very smart on the press department's behalf. They did little screenings throughout LA and Hollywood to preview the movie leading up to the August 1950 release. So that way and it was like little screenings of Hollywood elite. Like the Hollywood elite could put their name down on a list. And once they got up to 75 people, then they would hold a screening. Mm-hmm. And the very first screening of that series of screenings leading up to Sunset Boulevard's wide release in August of 1950 was a giant screening with 300 of Hollywood's elite. Mary Pickford was there, Joan Crawford was there, Barbara Stanwyck was there, like all of the big wigs. It was a much talked about film. So before the film, Louis B. Mayer, who was known as the King of Hollywood because he was the head of the biggest and the most wealthy studio in Hollywood, he took like the cast and the creatives of Sunset Boulevard out to dinner. And then they all went to a Paramount Studio screening room where 300 people of Hollywood's elite watched the movie. And usually it was reported that at the end of each of these screenings, there was very polite applause because there was always big Hollywood bigwigs there, like the studios, yes men. And Hollywood elite were like contract players. So they were all under contract to these big wigs. And they did not, if the big wigs thought that the picture was, trash, then they didn't want to offend the big wigs by clapping. According to Edith Head at the end of Sunset Boulevard, complete silence for several seconds, and then it was like a thunder crash, and people leapt to their feet, like screaming and clapping. And this is like 300 of Hollywood's biggest stars, along with Louis B. Mayer. And Gloria Swanson was ambushed by these big Hollywood stars in adoration, and Barbara Stanwyck ran up to her, fell to her feet, kissed the hem of her gown, gave her a great big hug. Louis B. Mayer stormed out of the screening. Let me see if I can find the quote. So Louis B. Mayer stormed out of the screening. He was a very angry little man because, like I said, Louis B. Mayer was all about making these big, beautiful films, kind of fluffy-like films that never explored reality in any way. It's like the head of production, Dory Sherry, was very interested in making film noirs, what he called message pictures. And most of the time, Louis B. Mayer hated those pictures. He hated Postman Always Rings Twice, which Dory Sherry had produced. He hated Battleground, which was about the horrors of World War II in 1949. Louis B. Mayer hated that. And there's also a story that I've read about Louis B. Mayer. I think Karina Longworth talks about it on You Must Remember This, when they're trying to make, Louis B. Mayer was sitting in a room with some producers and they were trying to make this very dark film noir. And Louis B. Mayer was not for it. And he asked one of the producers, he said, tell me something. So, do you think your wife is beautiful? And he said, yes. And he said, do you love your wife? And he said, yes. And he said, so when your wife goes to the bathroom to take a shit, do you leave the door open to watch her shit? And he said, no, I don't do that. And Louis B. Mayer is like, well, that's what I think about this picture. It's shit. You should not show the nasty undertones of any film. So that was Louis B. Mayer's outtake on movie making. So let's see. So Louis B. Mayer stormed out. Billy Wilder, who had been like ambushed in adoration, walked out. He was like on cloud nine. Walked past Louis B. Mayer. He was surrounded by like all of his producers, all of his yes men. Mm-hmm. And Louis B. Mayer rushed Wilder and he said, you befouled your own nest. You should be kicked out of this country, you goddamned foreigner son of a bitch. I mean, Louis B. Mayer was a foreigner too. And Wilder replied, I directed this picture. You can go F yourself. So, and he just walked away.
That's a power move.
I know. Well, and the great thing about that story is that Louis B. Mayer had been the king of Hollywood for so long, and he controlled so many facets of Hollywood. And he had Eddie Mannix, who was his fixer, who was in cahoots with a mob, and they controlled the police in 1930s, 1940s Hollywood. He had controlled absolutely everything. People were always dreaded Louis B. Mayer because they knew what he was capable of as really the king of Hollywood. In 1951, at the 1951 Oscars, Louis B. Mayer received an honorary Oscar statuette for distinguished service to the motion picture industry. And Charles Brackett, who was responsible for producing and partially writing Sunset Boulevard, presented him with the award, calling him one of our most distinguished citizens in Hollywood for founding the Motion Picture Academy Award and his inauguration of the star system. Louis B. Mayer said, "This fills me with humility and great responsibility in the years to come." Well, shortly after, in the next several months, Louis B. Mayer's boss, he didn't really have a boss in Hollywood, but his boss lived in New York. His boss, who was the head of Lowe's Incorporated owned MGM. They owned Louis B. Mayer. The head of Lowe's Incorporated was Joseph Skank, who hated Louis B. Mayer several months later because Louis B. Mayer had been overspending on each picture and not pulling back spending because of the advent of television, was kind of, running movies into the ground. Joseph Skank fired Louis B. Mayer from MGM, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. Well, and then it's kind of sad because then in 1957, after Dory Sherry had taken over the studio and almost run it into the ground, they went back to Louis B. Mayer and they said, "Would you want your old job back?" And he was dying of leukemia. So he died in 1957 of leukemia. So it's kind of a sad story. So real fast, we're going to talk about the Academy Awards, and then we're going to jump into we'll either stop recording or we'll talk about the thematic elements of Sunset Boulevard. So in 1951, at I think it was like the 23rd annual Academy Awards, Sunset Boulevard was nominated, I think, for like 11 different Oscars. And it was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Story and Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, Best Scoring of a Dramatic or Comedy Picture, and it won Best Story and Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Set Decoration, and Best Scoring of a Dramatic or Comedy Picture. Yes. Now, Gloria Swanson at that point had moved back to New York, and she was on Broadway in the musical On the 20th Century with Jose Ferrer, who was also nominated that year and won for Cyrano de Bergerac. So Gloria Swanson's birthday was on the 27th. The Oscars were on the 29th. So Jose Ferrer threw a birthday party for her on the evening of the 29th, starting at 11 o'clock at a club in New York City. And so because of that party, the Oscars in Los Angeles set up like a radio connection to New York City because there was a number of people that had been nominated that year, such as Celeste Holm, Thelma Ritter for All About Eve, George Cukor for Born Yesterday, Judy Holliday for Born Yesterday, Jose Ferrer for Cyrano de Bergerac. They were all in New York. So there was this radio connection, and it was a dual purpose party. It was Gloria Swanson's birthday party and the Academy Awards party, as I said before. So Gloria Swanson did not win that year. I'm sorry.
She should have. She was robbed. I'm going to say it. I'm going to get really close to the mic. I'm going to tell you she was robbed.
She was robbed. It was stolen from her.
Absolutely.
But, I mean, Judy Holliday won it, which I feel like Judy Holliday, for her short career, for her short life, she very much deserved an Oscar. I don't know if she deserved it for Born Yesterday, but she deserved it as a human being.
Yeah.
Yes, and Gloria Swanson.
But that was a great. How? Who else could sell that like she did? Like, we talked about people who rejected it, but like she just sold that film. I have a hard time believing that she didn't get the win for it. It just made me sad when I read that.
If it had been at the 1950s Oscars, it's been speculated that it would have won a lot more. The fact that it was up against Born Yesterday and All About Eve, and Gloria Swanson was up against Bette Davis, and they pretty much canceled each other out because they were these two big stars of old Hollywood that were both older stars in their 40s or 50s. They kind of competed against one another, so they canceled each other out. So, of course, it was Judy Holliday that won. And Gloria Swanson sat next to Judy Holliday, and when she won the award, according to Gloria Swanson, different people, she was very supportive. She was very, happy that Judy won the award. According to one of Judy Holliday's best friends, Judy Holliday told her best friend that Gloria Swanson, after she won, she turned to her and she said, "Couldn't you have won next year?" And she said it very hatefully. According to Judy Holliday. According to other sources, such as George Cukor, if she said something like that, it would have been in great jest.
Mm-hmm.
So whether she was hateful or very funny about it, she did not win that year. She did not win any year. She was nominated, I believe, for Sadie Thompson. Sadie Thompson, I think, at the first Academy Awards. So she had been nominated before.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'm going to finish this out with Joseph Almeikowicz. We started with a quote from Joseph Almeikowicz. Joseph Almeikowicz, said it was so hard to get close to reality with any film when he was a producer working at MGM. Along with that being the very first film that kind of outed Hollywood as this very dark and cruel place, that was the year that, or just shortly thereafter, that the man who was in charge of making Hollywood look like this very beautiful dream factory was also out of Hollywood, which starts the decline of the studio system and the modern the postmodern film, really, which started in the late 60s. So anyway, that is the history of Sunset Boulevard. Okay, so do you want to talk about a few thematic elements at Sunset Boulevard?
I would love to. Let's talk about it. There's a lot of dichotomies in the film. I think the most predominant one that I think about is the it's a love letter to film in a way, but it's also a scathing critique of the system that creates these films, because it does, you do see that a lot, even though it is kind of a scathing critique about the Hollywood system, you see that clearly they talk about how the system made her and made her this way, but it's also kind of a love letter to film. You see it when they talk with Betty. Every talk with Betty is a breath of fresh air. You get to hear that dialogue that you're used to hearing in a lot of these older films. You get to and she talks about loving it, and you can see he regains his passion for it. He was a cynic at the beginning. And was screw this. It's not worth it. We can't be too original, and we can't be, too plain. We got to be mediocre only. But he kind of regains that kind of love for film. And so it does, you do kind of get to see the joy in making a good movie and making art. But at the same time, scathing critique about everything else that happens. Because to get there, you do create issues, which leads to another part of the topics that I think kind of are still relevant today, because I know a lot of people see old black and white film, what does that have to do nowadays? Everybody knows, Hollywood does bad things, etc. But I think it could be said, the same could be said today with celebrity culture, to this point that it creates narcissism in people, and you can see that in small ways every day, influencers who get too big and get too excited about themselves because they only ever hear yes, or they hear how amazing they are or how great they are, and they make tons of money doing it, obscene amounts of money doing it, and are then able to kind of envelop themselves in narcissism as a way of kind of coping with this.
Well, and that's part of, real fast, that's really part of Gloria's problem, because she was only told yes until she was told no when she couldn't face that. So then she was enabled by her first husband, Max, who came back and was like, no, you are the greatest star of all, and I'm going to prove this to you for the entire film, until he could no longer prove it because Joe Gillis stripped it away from her. And part of it is Max von Meyerling as her first husband. You can't exactly tell if he's doing it out of love, or if he is obsessed with her as he's an obsessive fan. I think it's a combination of both. Eric von Stroheim plays this character so beautifully, because you can see it in his eyes when she loses her mind, just the hurt and the pity that he has for her. And you can tell that he loves her, but at the same time, to keep up this facade for 20 years, there has to be some sort of obsession and something also kind of wrong in his mind as well.
Yes, because he had a flourishing directorial career and then became a butler. In order to do that, you'd have to have some sort of deep devotion or something twisted about that. It's wild to see.
Oh, for sure. Sure. One of the very first things that you said was, this is the definitive Hollywood horror movie, and it is a Hollywood nightmare. I mean, on Thursday night before we started recording, and we're recording on Sunday morning, I'd written all of these notes for Sunset Boulevard, and I was like, what I haven't done since college is watch Sunset Boulevard. And so, and I had seen it a million times, but like watching it with older eyes now,
Mhm.
because I'm such an old man at 27 years old.